Hi, welcome everybody to the California Civil Liberties Public Education Program informational webinar. This is for funding that's generally being allocated during the fiscal year of 17-18. My name is Mary Beth Barber. I'm the Special Projects Coordinator for the California State Library, and I'll be the one leading everybody through the webinar today. Just some real quick things to note. I have everybody muted because of the large number of people who are involved in this webinar and who are interested. I am taking questions that I will answer if I can on the at the end of the webinar. It should be taking just about an hour. But also, you can email me at marybeth.barber@library.ca.gov if you have any additional questions. This webinar will also be recorded and available for viewing afterwards in case you need to bow out or you're in the middle of another project or you weren't able to attend. So that said, we go ahead and get started on what the details are. First, the overview of what we're going to be talking about today. First thing I'm going to instruct you through is how to ask a question here with the exact details of how to type that up. Then I'll give some background and history for the program, as well as the current status of the program. And then we'll go through the application process, important documents, eligibility, funding categories, important dates. So everybody knows, what the review criteria overview is, and then we'll talk a little bit about the online application. We have a new system set up this year, which will work much better than it did last year for those folks who are coming back. And then I'll take questions through the Q&A box and answer them if I can. So first, if you have a question, you should, now I did pick up this graphic from last year, so my apologies if they have updated the system, but I believe that you should be able to go to the little blue sign down at the bottom of the webinar in order to type a question in, and I will be able to view it and see it there at the end when we get through all the slides. And that's what it should look like when you chat with the presenter. So the purpose of the California Civil Liberties Program, this is directly out of the law, this particular quote. Also, by the way, this the PowerPoint as a PDF PowerPoint will also be available on the website. So some of these slides are pretty dense in terms of the language, but you can always go back and take a look at them. So this tells a little bit about why the Civil Liberties Program exists. And it initiated because of if you notice in that quote, talking about what happened during World War II with civilians and permanent residents of Japanese ancestry, and the fact that there were some major civil liberty violations that happened during that time. I mean, the history of that is, of course, that there was the wartime hysteria after Pearl Harbor during World War II. An executive order was signed it's actually 76 years ago, and there was the forced removal of American citizens as well as legal residents and put into camps. They were called relocation or internment camps, as is pointed out frequently. They resembled prisons because in essence that's what they were. They weren't temporary, as it noted here. These particular quotes are all from a document that came out in the 80s called Personal Justice Denied. It was a two-part overview of the massive civil liberty violations that had happened. That particular document led to President Ronald Reagan and Congress enacting a law that publicly apologized to the Japanese Americans and the legal residents of Japanese descent who fell victim to this particular wartime hysteria and the actions of the government. They made restitution to those interested and then created a public education fund. And it was $5 million in the 80s on the federal level. Well, when those education funds, which the purpose of was to let the entire public in the United States know what had happened and that this was a major situation and it should never happen again. When those education funds, and when we use the word education, that's a very broad term. It's education and public awareness. California afterwards thought, you know what, people still don't know enough about this. So in 1998, a bill was introduced by Assemblymember Honda, and then as a temporary measure to provide educational and background about the situation. In 2000, another Assemblymember Nakano, continued the program as long as there was funding available for it. That was what the law read, that this is an ongoing program if there's funding made available. And so for a decade, there was funding available, but then funding ceased starting in July of 2011. And the program was essentially quiet, not dead, because it was still on the books as an ongoing program. But it wasn't funded, which meant it wasn't actually enacted until for fiscal year 16 and 17, and Assemblyman Ting put in $1 million of one-time funds. And historically, the State Library was the ones who had fulfilled this particular program, and so we were able to reboot. We didn't know last year if it was going to only be a one-year program or a multi-year program, but then we got word that yes, it will be a multi-year program. Governor Brown, with support from Assemblyman Murasuchi, included $3 million over 3 years. It was out of one fiscal year. It's kind of, typically things are budgeted on an annual basis. This particular one was budgeted from one fiscal year, but for 3 years worth of funding, and it's $3 million over 3 years. So it essentially brings in programs or brings in funding for programs until June of 2020. There are some updates that came with the legislation, not just the budget bill, but then AB 417 by Assemblyman Murasuchi. Administrative details were clarified, and an advisory board was established, and there was the encouragement of more discussion, not just about what happened during World War II, always linking back to it, but really taking a look at civil rights violations or civil liberty injustices that are perpetuated on the basis of an individual's race, national origin, immigration status, religion, gender, or sexual orientation, as well as the internment of the Japanese Americans during World War II. That's, this little quote is straight out of the guidelines for this year. Now, that catches us up with, what's going to be happening now. The California State Library website has on its website, and that's the website that you see up there, the guidelines for the program. We also have a frequently asked questions. That's going to be a blending of questions that we have had in the past or had expected, but also as questions come in from potential grantees or applicants, I will do my best to update it, because update this document so that everybody knows what kind of questions and answers are being presented. We will have a little before you start your application, things to think about. This was really important last year because we did not have a partial save feature. That is in the application this year, the ability to save a draft. So I'll deal with that a little bit as we continue through this webinar. And then there are two different applications when you see in there. One of them is for education, preservation, and public media. Those are big programs that will take a large region area or are essentially of the magnitude that it's a statewide or statewide importance size of the project. And then other applications that will fit under the community projects category. As you know, the informational webinar is happening as we speak right now, and then there's a press release announcing the program. There's also at the bottom some contact info for me as well as others, background information about the internment, and then historical information about the California Civil Liberties Program. Let's discuss eligibility and who's eligible to receive funds through the Civil Liberties Program. Applicants must be California-based nonprofit organizations or California-based satellite offices of regional or national nonprofit organizations or a unit of state or local government. Partners are definitely encouraged to apply. I mean, the idea of multiple partners working together in order to strengthen and further a project in this for this grant absolutely makes sense. Only one of those partners, though, can be the applicant. And so somebody would need to be designated as the one who applies with additional information about the partners available in the grant application. For groups or for individuals who are trying to build up a group, fiscal agents can be used, and in those cases should be used if you don't have a 501c3 already formed. Now the fiscal agent is the one who's the applicant organization and assumes financial and contractual responsibilities if awarded a grant. And then the project description and the project lead would be the individuals who are actually doing the project itself. Only one application per applicant. If there is a fiscal agent working on two different projects, that can be allowed. Please, if that is the case, have the fiscal agent, meaning the organization that's applying, contact me directly just so I know that it's not one organization that's applied twice. But otherwise, you can only apply once. So you can't apply in both categories. So you can't turn around and have a duplicate application in community projects that you would have in one of the other, the public media, education, or preservation category. For all applicants, and you'll see this in the guidelines. A lot of this information is just straight out of the guidelines. Successful applicants to the program must demonstrate that they meet the following criteria: that they've got the capability and capacity to administer and complete the proposed project, and to do it when you say you're going to, and within the budget that you say you're going to. You have to have the expertise, knowledge, and qualifications, or folks on your team need to fulfill the project. And then every project, even if you're dealing with other civil liberty violations and a focus there, include information about what happened during Japanese Americans during World War II. That is the reason why this program exists, and it is a key to explaining and keeping in with the original intent of the Civil Liberties Program to talk about what happened. Sorry, I think now all projects, all of the different projects should deal with these key issues and key goals. And again, this is all straight from the guidelines. Obviously, the project must deal with civil liberty injustices, and there is a repeat of all of the different categories of the types of civil liberty violations that can happen, including the Japanese American experience. You need to have a public educational impact. The purpose of this funding is to maximize the long-term educational impact to the California public or to specific segments of the California public. When you are looking at specific segments, think big. So don't think about a very, very small subset. So example, if it's an educational project, the subset is all K through 12 children. Well, that's a subset that is 6.4 million big. So when we're talking about subsets, we're not talking about a small, narrow piece. We are talking about larger groups. The projects need to expand on the current information that is available out there about civil liberty violations, including, but not exclusively, the Japanese American experience during World War II. And there needs to be a variety of different perspectives and experience. This is actually straight out of the law of encouraging that, so that, for example, they give an example there of thinking sort of outside of the box in terms of who was directly impacted. It's just something to keep in mind when you're taking a look at your project. And then you definitely need to expand the public awareness. There has to be an outreach component for the public in order to boost public awareness of the civil liberty violations that your project deals with. And having that plan will be essential to applications. The funding categories. We have two different ones. The first category here of education, preservation, or public media, as I said before, is these are like big impact ones that are either can directly impact statewide or even nationally and internationally at times, or are very big region focused. The maximum request this year in that category is $100,000, and we estimate to have an allocation in that category of $600,000 available. For community projects, the maximum request is $30,000, and we have $350,000 approximately allocated for that this year. In terms of the difference with the community projects, or what we mean by community projects, I'll be dealing with that in a second. Now, looking first at education. This is a very dense slide because I pulled most of this information directly from the guidelines. These are the key components that you have to have in an education project and proposal. They should include the Japanese American experience. Other examples, linking to current day is, or having a component of that in the proposal. It should be part of it. There should be widespread use or dissemination of information, and a plan for that dissemination, as well as following the standards in the educational network that you're working in. So if you are looking at a major education project for K-12 students, folks that put in a proposal in that category should be very aware of the California standards, especially for history and social science, as well as for language, English language arts or English language development. English language arts is your general English classes. English language development are for English language learners. And then the visual and performing arts standards. These are all found over at the California Department of Education's website. They have the standards and the frameworks listed on the site. And successful applications in this category will be very familiar with that. Now, if you are dealing with college level projects, the project needs to be academically rigorous, following higher education protocols, and include expertise from widely accepted experts within that academic area. And keep in mind, these are going to be big projects where there's already an implementation plan that's part of the proposal. Smaller projects or partial subjects, so you're only taking a look at one aspect of this, folks who are interested in applying in that way should seriously look at the community programs category instead. Preservation. So much of the information that we need to take a look at what happened not only during World War II, but in many other circumstances. We need to if we're looking back in history, we need to preserve the materials as well as the histories of what happened during that time period. And so the preservation category is very specifically for the digitization of materials, for digital reformatting and preservation of some of these materials, in-house repair, improved storage and handling, security, environmental controls and stabilization, conservation treatment, or other vital preservation efforts. Again, this is going to be for large-scale and complicated preservation projects that are fully or nearly fully devoted to the subject of this grant program. If you have a major project where only a component really is relating to the Civil Liberties program, then I would recommend applying under the community programs category rather than the preservation category. And even with this there needs to be, again, an outreach component. Preservation is really about maintaining the materials, but having information in the application that talks about how that can be used and how it can be viewed or can augment wide public education and wide understanding, and how it can augment that is going to be key for a successful application in this category. And then public media. Applicants are going to be nonprofit media organizations or nonprofit organizations with media production, distribution, or directly related support services as their central mission. And sometimes these particular units are actually units of government that have a public media function. So those are the three types of applicants in that category. And again, for public media, Japanese American experience has to be included somewhere. Others' experience should also, and linking it makes sense. Because this is California state funds, and this actually goes for all of the grants, we really should be talking about Californians and featuring Californians or the impact on Californians through under the umbrella of civil liberty and violations and civil rights issues. A successful public media project will create discussion, fostering community dialogue, engagement, multiple types of platforms. This gives an example of some of them, but really it's not just about information going in one direction, but rather discussion and then civic engagement, and promoting in a positive manner or a collective problem-solving manner how to connect to the different cultures, communities, and groups. Again, these are going to be for very big projects. If there is a smaller project or a component of a much larger project, then applicants in the public media area should consider going to the community projects category. Let's talk about the community projects. So community projects are kind of a catch-all for a lot of the everything else categories. So, films, narrative, and documentary fit in this category. Books, that includes graphic novels and others, as well as live readings, that would fit in the community projects category. Photo collections and exhibits, visual art exhibits, museum displays, performances of drama, dance, music, oral histories. Document and material preservation can fit in here if it's a smaller project. Educational guides and curriculum can fit in here if it, again, is a smaller project. Website tools, that's a great funding for this that don't quite fit the broad, say it's not part of a public media outreach, but instead is a smaller website tool. Essay and literature project, public arts, and music and recordings. This is all the catch-all for the community projects. And this is historically, for the 10 years that the program was funded, is the category of projects from the past. Key components are, again, Californians, community activity, community discussion, civic engagement, making sure that you connect to the Japanese American experience, if not principally talk about that, and then make sure that the project that you're working on is publicly accessed. I want to remind everybody, and this is again in the guidelines, that there are certain things that cannot be funded. One of them is, we can't fund fundraising activities such as grant writing or fund a fundraiser. That is not kosher under state rules. Grantee organizations that are not in compliance with from another grant. I don't know if necessarily this will apply. This is only the second year of this program. Any current grantee can come back from the Civil Liberties Program, can come back and apply again. This question has already come up. Strongly encouraging, definitely not for the same project. And when I say same project, I mean literally the same project. So if this was a preservation project, for example, and the funding from last year only did half of it to come back and say, well, this is for the other half. It needs to be something new, especially if the project was said it was going to be done and then it wasn't done. Well, that doesn't really work. If you're coming back with new audiences for a new take on what was funded the previous year, maybe the same project, new or expanded audience, that would be legitimate. We'll accept the applications. It's just keep in mind that in the review process there will be a comparison from what was presented previously. We don't fund federal agencies. We don't fund for-project organizations as applicants. The applicants need to be under the eligibility, going back there. And so anybody who's working as a sole proprietor should take a look at finding a fiscal receiver. Programs need to be accessible to the public. A private program funded by state dollars does not make sense. This funding cannot promote a particular political, religious, or ideological point of view. Indirect overhead costs over 5% are not allowed under this program. We're only funding overhead up to 5%. Keep in mind, overhead is different than a direct administrative cost. Direct administrative costs, it costs everything to put on a project, and putting that under the administrative cost is fine. Saying that just generally, just to apply and overhead, meaning the cost for the heating bill, for example, can't take any more than 5% of what you are requesting. We do not fund cash reserves. Hey, we need some extra funds because our reserves are low. Nope, that's an inappropriate use for the Civil Liberties Program. Same thing with endowment funds. Utilizing funds to pay for fines, penalties, bad debt, deficit rejection, nope, that's inappropriate for this program. This is a project-based program. This particular program does not allow for the purchase of equipment, land, building, or construction. We also don't out-of-state activities. Now, this is California state funds for California projects. Hospitality or food costs that are not directly related to travel, not an appropriate use of Civil Liberties funds. And if you do have something, you can have it as part of the project, just can't pay for it with Civil Liberties funds. And then any expenses that were incurred before the start or after the ending date of the grant period. And you'll be able to outline that in the timeline and the budget. The review criteria, so everybody knows how their proposals will be evaluated. I'm not going to go and read this slide, but it's really the quality and appropriateness of the project impact, and then the fiscal management and the project leadership involved in that project. These are going to be your three main evaluations areas. In general, we take a look at a 1 to 10 ranking system, with 10 being the model. It is everything that you could want in a Civil Liberties project, and then 1 being ineligible, just it's not an appropriate application for this program. The important dates: today is the webinar. April 20th is the application deadline. In May, the advisory panel will review, and then funding notifications should go out in June. And the funding activity period is July 1st until June 30th, so 1 year. Now, the online application, we have a new grant management system, or GMS. You'll see on the Civil Liberties page that there are separate links to get into the application for the education, preservation, or public media projects, and then the community projects. And this was key for this year. We have the ability to save a draft of your project. They're like before, it's separated into 6 sections. While I say 6 sections, they're not 6 different pages. It's one long page that you will see when you look at the application. But there are 6 main parts. The first one is just your basic information, as well as legislative information and geographic region. Because this was initiated by the legislature, we like to keep track of where the Civil Liberties Program is happening. So by putting in your and letting us know the Assembly District, the Senate District, the Congressional District, and then the general geographic regions of the impact of a program for our data collection. The next section in the online form is project information, and that's going to be a narrative. And then the next 3 sections, the timeline, the budget, and the applicant information about the organization, as well as the key personnel. All of those, we do have the ability to type information into the form, although I would strongly recommend considering building these documents and then uploading them afterwards, building them in an alternative program, so either Word or as a PDF for the timeline and for the applicant information, the key personnel, creating your own budget in Excel, and then uploading that. And then section 6, or the last little section, you can upload additional materials that you'd like us to see. So the details of it. Section 1, we need the basic information, the official name of the organization. Please be really careful when you put that in, that is exactly what's on the 501c3 documentation. We need all systems to talk to each other, and if ours end up being not perfect, then it creates a delay oftentimes when it comes to payments eventually if you do get a grant. You need to let us know, what kind of organization you are. We'll need the Federal Employee Identification Number, or EIN, the nickname of the organization if there is one. So if there's an alternative name that's used, that helps. Also, if we'll need contact information for both the programming lead as well as the billing lead, and then of course, as I had said before, the legislative and geographic information. This is the next area of the application is where you talk about your project. So we need to know how much you are requesting. The maximum amounts are $30,000 and then $100,000, as you can see. What category is being sought for this, a description of the project in just a really brief one that's really more of a blurb than anything, and then a detailed description of the project. And then there are very specific questions relating to the project category that are unique to all of the different areas. Then there is a timeline that we ask. As I said, there was a month-by-month fill-in chart that's been created. Although I do recommend potentially, especially if you want to include a lot of detail, to create your own documentation and then upload it as a separate document. Keeping in mind the project needs to start in the summer of 2018 and funding needs to be spent. The project can keep going, but the funding needs to be spent. So this, apologies, this bullet is not quite an accurate statement. The funding needs to be concluded, and what you have proposed in the application needs to be concluded no later than June 30th of 2019. And I'll show you the information about the table. So this is one little slice of what the online form looks like. If you see there where it says Table Project Timeline, when an application has been done, this was a fake application that I went ahead and created. Here's why I'm suggesting people don't just type into the table, but rather actually submit their own documents. That when it is viewed online, the table is not exactly perfect. This is what you would necessarily see if you were to try to view it through the web viewer. Keep in mind, if you do type into the table, rest assured your data is safe. This is the next one that I wanted to show you, that in those tables, you can download as an Excel document, and you will see all of the information that's in there. I pulled this one from the budget, but it works exactly the same, that everything is actually in there already, and that's a way to download and save your documents afterwards. So even if you do use the online tables as part of the service, there are ways to view the data. In a budget, components of a budget typically include the services, materials, labor costs, travel. There are two different sections to put in for budget. There's budget and then there's income. In the Civil Liberties Program guidelines, you will see that matching funding is encouraged, including in-kind donations, meaning help, labor, space for free, that kind of thing. And that's where you can put in the information about the in-kind donations is going to be into that income statement. When you do put in a budget, review the information about what can and cannot be funded by the Civil Liberties Program. If you have components that can't be funded but you're bringing in funds from another area, make sure that your budget and income clearly state, okay, yes, this is a component. It's not normally, can't be funded by this funding. The Civil Liberties funding is going for this, but we're getting funding for this component from elsewhere. Just make sure that that is very clear so that there isn't a question when doing the evaluation that Civil Liberties funding would be applied to things that we technically can't fund with this program. And then remember, no more than 5% for general overhead, although administrative costs that are directly related are their own line item. The next section in the review process, reviewers will need to know about your organization and or the key personnel. If the organization is a fiscal receiver, we want to know about just who the fiscal sponsor or fiscal receiver is. And then we'll want to know about the key personnel and the group that's actually doing the project. For an organization, we'd want to know the mission, the goals, other overview information. If it's a team that has found a fiscal sponsor, talk about the team. And then talk about the individuals. Ideally, this is all going to be in narrative form, not just a resume or a CD uploaded. And you can always submit attachments that have links that you can send the reviewers over to take a look. And then finally, in the last section, this is where it's really simply just an upload button. You can upload materials. You've got up to 5 different uploads. So that could include samples of past projects, additional information, about the organization or the projects, or the participants, I'm sorry. If you feel that there needs to be a much more detailed plan provided to explain everything, this is where you can put that in, and then any other information that might be useful. If you have videos that you want the reviewers to take a look at, you can also provide links here. Upload them into a Word document or a PDF and put them in there at this point. Some of the frequently asked questions that we've gotten in the past, do you accept fiscal sponsors? And yes, we absolutely do. And the guidelines will give you a definition of exactly what a fiscal sponsor is. This has become more readily used and more popular. There are more nonprofit organizations that do look for good community members to partner with and to sponsor. So if you have any questions about this specifically, I don't think we're going to be able to here at the library find you a fiscal sponsor, but we can I'm certainly willing to have a conversation about where you might look for a good one. Other ones, can proposal themes be contemporary civil liberties issues, or does it have to just be about the Japanese internment during World War II? This is a detailed quote from the guidelines. The guidelines pretty much come directly from the law. So take a look here that yes, in general, the exclusion and the internment and de facto imprisonment of the Japanese Americans and resident aliens during World War II must be included in the projects in terms of information being provided to the public. But as you can see from especially bullet number 2 and number 3, linking these historic situations to the present, as well as taking a look at civil liberty violations from other circumstances in number 2. And then number 4 here, again, this is directly from the law, talk about different ways that that might be done. Another question. This was one from last year, just in general. So, you know, a filmmaker in the middle of the production of a project. One thing to keep in mind is that for the public media category, the applicants have to have a public media distribution arm, essentially. That one component of the public media category, it's going to be more appropriate in the community project area. Will the grant amounts be exactly what is requested? No, and anybody who applied last year or did a comparison will know that the amount that was awarded to the awardees was significantly less, up to 40% less actually, than the request. A lot of reasons for that. If there are enough, you know, like last year, because it was quite competitive last year, if there are a number of quality projects that are presented and it is decided by the review team to try to fund as much as possible, some of those could be smaller. Also, the ranking can oftentimes impact the amount that is awarded through a program. One thing to note is that if a program is awarded significantly, if a proposal is awarded significantly less than was proposed, a revised budget will be asked for by the state library, just so we have confidence that the project can actually be fulfilled. Are matching funds required? This is a direct quote from the guidelines. Again, encouraged for dollar-to-dollar match, but it is not technically required, and they can be in kind. So this is the point where I take a look at some of the questions that have come in. So the eligibility requirements, funding not being made available for federal grant proposals. We had a question of whether or not federal funds could be counted as matching funds. Here's the I'm going to go back to the eligibility requirements. So hang on, everybody. I'm taking the questions in order. While I'm looking for the exact card that I'm talking about, what we don't fund is definitely not federal agencies, and where the principals work for federal agencies. A project that is already funded by funds that are coming from a federal source, and these are not funds that would supplant them, meaning that the federal funds would be sent back, but rather complement a project, is perfectly fine. But we would not fund an agency of the federal government, if that makes sense. I'm going to try to dive deeper into this question and post it on the FAQ to be more clear. Somebody had the question about the purchase of equipment and whether or not materials to create projects for a proposal. Materials are fine and absolutely allowed under this program. When we say purchase of equipment, we're talking about major equipment pieces that the Civil Liberties program is not to support, sort of a general support for an organization, or buying anything that on a tax form would have a depreciation value over time, that is not an appropriate use of civil liberties funds. Supplies that you would need in order to fulfill for the one-time or the short-term use, absolutely. Even if it's going to be, so materials that are going to be used for museum display are perfectly allowed. We had a question of, because public media projects can take some time to develop, and whether or not the grant period can be longer than 1 year. Right now for this round, we have a limited time period that's set. This is a good comment, and I will present it to leadership here at the State Library for consideration. Not necessarily for this round of funding, but perhaps for the next one. We have a lot of interest from the university community. One thing about the Civil Liberties Fund is that these Civil Liberties program, these funds are not to supplant other ongoing programming or things that should be paid for from another source. So the question deals specifically with I'm going to table this question and put it into the FAQ. It deals very specifically with a higher education issue. So if you are involved in higher education, take a look at the FAQ in a few days and see the answer to this question. Next question. What does outreach mean in regards to key project issues and goals? Our outreach means keep in mind, the purpose of this program is to inform the public in a meaningful way about civil liberty violations, linking it back to the civil liberty violations that happened during World War II to Japanese Americans and Japanese resident aliens. That informing through dialogue, through information, as many members of the California public as possible to be thinking about these issues and to be learning about these issues is the key purpose of this program. And as we've already gone through, there are many ways to fulfill the key mission of this program, or the key purpose, but every proposal should have some kind of outreach or public education purpose. We had a question about who sits on the advisory review panel. That is a new development that was established. Previously, it was essentially a peer review panel that was advising the state library and the state librarian. Currently, the legislation from last year by Assemblyman Marisucci established an advisory board that are appointed by the governor's office and by the legislature. We are still awaiting to find out who will be on that advisory board. There's more information that I will provide in an answer in the FAQ about exactly the breakup of the, who appoints whom and when and how. It's not a decision-making body. It is an advisory board, and that's pretty much it. That doesn't change the law for that. It instead makes sure that the folks that are advising are appointed by the governor and then by the legislature. There was a question of whether or not admission can be charged if this is going to be some kind of public performance of some kind. One thing to keep in mind, the public has to be invited, so nobody can be excluded. And it will be up to the proposer to convince of the public awareness and public good components of the proposal about, that their project is worthy of being funded. So I'm not going to say no or yes, because that is not up to me. This will be an evaluation component, keeping in mind that access for as many Californians and folks in California as possible to become educated on these issues is the key purpose of this program. And I will leave it up to the proposer, to the folks writing the grant application to figure out that one. There was a question of whether or not out-of-state activities would mean that a contractor that lives in a different state could not be funded. If the activity then takes place, meaning that there are the public awareness turns out to be more important to an alternative geographic location outside of California, then that would not be looked upon favorably by under the review criteria that we had and by the advisory panel. If in order to fulfill quality awareness programs in California, the inclusion of somebody who happens to live out of state as part of the labor process or as an expert, that should be fine. The key component about the out-of-state activities means that the activities that as part of the project are actually taking place, meaning the public activities, the interaction with the public are taking place. I would caution, however, that out-of-state travel is looked upon pretty carefully by the state of California, and there's no problem with having out-of-state travel, but I would strongly recommend finding alternative funds for that type of activity. There's different situations that deal directly with the topic at hand of the Civil Liberties Program, but that the actual civil liberty violations may have taken place outside of the state of California or for a component of it. Excuse me. For that type of situation, I would recommend explaining the worthiness of the program, especially as it relates to Californians. And then any outreach and awareness about the proposal or the components of the actual project itself. Explain how in the proposal what's the impact on Californians, both of the initial civility violation subject, as well as how the outreach will take place. And I don't see any other questions that are here. So, and we only have 5 minutes before this is supposed to end. So thank you everybody for being part of this. I do see some hands raised. I don't know how to use that particular feature. For the folks who may have wanted to ask a question but were unable to because of confusion with the system, which does happen, please go ahead and feel free to email me. My email is marybeth. I'm going to get to the beginning of this. My email is marybeth.barber@library.ca.gov, and I'm hoping I have that slide. There we go. So that's my email. Feel free to go ahead and email me. Please do take a look at the FAQ document that will be posted online. This webinar will be available after the fact, and we'll have that on our website as well in the Civil Liberties Program section. And thank you everybody for attending. Bye-bye.